Ilya, thank you very much. I think what we're already hearing is a trend of some potential gaps in Western laws, and then where laws do exist elsewhere, the misapplication of those laws. John, why don't I turn to you next for your remarks? Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Good morning, everyone. Congratulations to Natalia and the team on this very impressive and timely publication. My contribution in some ways is rather modest, but I chose to highlight the shocking case of injustice involving a Russian family in Guatemala. I've been involved with this case for now just over 4 years. I believe it demonstrates not just the long arm of the Russian state, but it also shows how deeply it can penetrate a country which has weak institutions and no rule of law. I worked on several cases involving Russian business people who've, let's put it this way, have lost control of their assets in Russia and then been forced to flee, found themselves on the receiving end, ultimately, of criminal proceedings in Russia, and then the Russian authorities have tried on the basis of those proceedings to get them back to Russia. And they tend to use then mutual legal assistance arrangements, Interpol tools, criminal interests effectively in Russia are then dressed up in these clothes of internationally acceptable legal procedures that have analogues in rule of law countries and appear quite respectable. And lawyers call this the presumption of regularity. So when you get a request from the Russian prosecutor's office, you sort of assume that must be formulated on the same way as it would be in the equivalent in the United States or indeed in my country, in Britain. But in the case of the Bitkovs, the Bitkov family in Guatemala, I've never seen anything like this before. The reason is that this family has been pursued with extraordinary determination and energy, and the really distressing thing is that their innocent children have been targeted in the process. So let me split my presentation into two parts. I'll talk a little bit about what happened to the Bitkovs, and then I'll attempt to draw some conclusions from that. Let me say firstly, I think the really remarkable thing about this case is how the Russian side has been able to get into the legal process in Guatemala, which has included co-opting the highly respected International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which is known by the Spanish acronym CICIG. This is a powerful anti-corruption agency that operates under the aegis of the United Nations, and it receives financial support from several Western countries, including the United States, which supplies about half its budget, Canada, Germany, Sweden, the UK, and the European Union. So the story of the Bitkovs. Igor and Irina Bitkov were a young entrepreneurial couple who ran a successful paper-producing business in the northwest of Russia. As the Putin system became embedded in the sort of mid-naughty years, they had a falling out with the new governor who'd been appointed there in the region where they had their main plant. They refused to donate to United Russia, the ruling party, or get involved with it, and they backed their own candidates in regional elections. And I think it's fair to say that revenge was swift. And the pressure initially came in the form of the kidnapping of their 16-year-old daughter by a criminal gang that was working under the authority of the FSB in St. Petersburg. Absolutely terrible things happened to their daughter, which left her with lasting psychiatric damage. Her parents had to pay a ransom for her release. Then, despite an impeccable credit record, with the majority of the loans to their plants paid off, 2 state banks called in their loans in 48 hours and took over the company. This is a sort of classic corporate raid model. The Bitkovs fled to Europe. They were told to return and to pay a fee to settle their problem. They refused to do this, and they were then threatened, and they were basically told that we will hunt you down, and if we have to, we will kill you. That was the message that they understood. The banks that had stolen or taken over their business then accused them, the Bitkovs, of embezzling the loans. The loans were not repaid in full for the simple reason that the banks took over the business, but they had then assets which were the collateral for the loans in the first place. So there should have been no issue really around the repayment ultimately of those loans. But the structures affiliated with those banks sold the plant's valuable equipment, and in some cases simply for scrap metal. So believing their lives were in danger and they would be hunted down, they responded to an advertisement by a Panama-based law firm that was offering citizenship services in Guatemala. They saw no obvious connections with Russia, between Guatemala and Russia, and importantly, there was no extradition treaty between Russia and Guatemala. So through this law firm, they began the naturalization process. They learned Spanish. They quickly received their documents, and on the advice of the law firm, they took new identities. And I would say, despite the trauma of losing their business in Russia and having to flee the country, they did find new happiness. Irina Bitkova became pregnant and gave birth to a second child, a little boy called Vladimir, who was born in 2012. They'd left Russia in 2009. They bought a house in a rather pleasant gated community on the outskirts of Guatemala City and settled down. So it rather seemed as though they'd just got away. But they could not have been more mistaken, because 3 years later, 5 o'clock in the morning in January the 15th of 2015, they were arrested. 70 armed police swooped on their house. And it turned out that they'd been arrested on a documents charge. The documents they had were genuine, but they had been illegally issued. It turned out that there was a flourishing passport business in Guatemala that was operating with high-level patronage. So technically, they had committed an offence by using illegally issued documents. This is normally settled by a fine in Guatemala and then expulsion from the country. But the Bitkovs had an important legal argument that was to appear later, namely that under something called the Palermo Convention, they were migrants who did not have criminal liability, in this case, for possessing the documents that they had received. But the authorities accused them of being part of a criminal group issuing passports and not just its users. And an absolutely unspeakable nightmare followed. Anastasia, the daughter, had a nervous breakdown after 5 days in detention, held in an open cell underneath in a parking lot underneath the main court building. I visited that place. It is absolutely horrendous. Under pressure from CICIG, the anti-corruption agency, the 3-year-old little boy was put into an orphanage for 42 days before being returned to his guardians, and he returned in a really traumatized state and in poor health. And after nearly 3 years in detention, the Bitkovs were tried as part of a criminal structure engaged in the issue of false documents. Igor Bitkov received a 19-year jail sentence, yes, 19, his wife and daughter 14 years each. So of 5,000 people, roughly, who had received passports over a 2-year period, the Bitkovs were the only ones to stand trial. So the prosecutors alleged that, among other things, that they had manipulated data in the systems of the National Registrations Agency. How they could have done this without speaking a word of Spanish on arrival in Guatemala when their applications were made, of course, is something that's never been answered. The real criminal structure in operation was never investigated, not least because one of the senior officials in the public ministry that prosecuted the Bitkovs had actually personally been involved in the illegal passport business and had, in this case, signed off on Anastasia Bitkova's residence permit. And there is evidence that other senior officials were similarly implicated. Now, there is substantial evidence pointing to how the Russian side was able to enter this legal process related to the passports, and it did so based on the false allegation that the Bitkovs had embezzled loans in Russia. It was able to recruit CICIG, the anti-corruption agency, to its cause, and the lawyers hired by the 2 Russian state banks, VTB and Gazprom Bank, played a role in having the Bitkovs case made part of this broader investigation, or so-called investigation, into the illegal passports business. And this investigation only targeted low-level officials.
One more minute.
That's fine. Now, thanks to a powerful lobbying campaign spearheaded by Bill Browder, the Bitkovs were freed from prison a year ago and placed under house arrest. Now, let me just draw very quickly a couple of conclusions from this. Firstly, the Russian system is able to operate very effectively in places such as Guatemala. It's perceived by some political forces as being a first world country that is anti-American, and therefore an attractive partner. It knows how to apply pressure. It hired the top 2 law firms in Guatemala. At least one of them had done no due diligence, never questioned the Russian narrative. Under Russian influence, I believe that CICIG, the anti-corruption agency, has been responsible for gross violation of the Bitkov's human rights. And the interesting point here is that CICIG's Western funders and supporters of the anti-corruption effort have been deaf to calls for investigation of CICIG's role in the prosecution of the Bitkovs. To question the agency's integrity is to be seen to ally yourself with corrupt interests in Guatemala. Yet there are very strong indications that those 2 Russian state banks, VTB and Gazprom Bank, both under US and EU sanctions, have collaborated with this agency and benefited from Western involvement in the anti-corruption effort in Guatemala. Let me stop there. Thanks, Todd.
John, thank you very much. And I think what you're highlighting is something that comes out in the report as well, which is that we tend to focus on the Russian activities in the United States and in Europe, but obviously the reach is beyond that. We